What is up, you guys? Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another gruesome Get Ready With Me video. If this is your first time seeing my face, well, then I'm tickled pink that you're here. My name is Jessica, and every week I sit down here and talk about a true crime case whilst I put on some makeup. So if that sounds good to you, I'd say subscribe and stick around. Ooh, if you're really into this whole thing, you could even turn on your post notifications. Then YouTube might let you know every time I post a video. I mean, it's a crapshoot either way, but I don't think it'll hurt your odds. But there's also every chance that it might. I don't know how it works. Either way though, moving right along. Before I hop into today's case, I truly just want to give the biggest shout out to Isabella for not only requesting this case, but for helping me so incredibly, tremendously with it. This is a case from her home country, and I cannot even begin to put into words how incredible it was to not only be able to speak directly to someone who knows the culture so well, but who's so beautifully passionate about it. So truly, thank you, Isabella. And not just for what you did to help me with this case, but for the stories you shared with me, the recipes you've shared with me, and for being a friend. And with all of that said and done, let's go ahead and get into today's case. All right, y'all, pack your bags and grab your sunscreen because we are headed damn near to the equator today. Okay, realistically, we're technically gonna be like a little bit south of the equator, but the equator does technically pass through the country that we're set in today. The specific city, though, well, that falls about 1,600 miles south, give or take. Brazil. We're headed to Brazil. And that is Brazil with an S, by the way, because we will not be anglicizing South America's largest country here today. Ooh, and ironically, not only are we in South America's largest country, but we are also in the largest country's largest city. Brazil as a whole is the 5th largest country in the world, while Sao Paulo is one of the most populous cities on the planet. And then given its size and population, it should come as no surprise that Brazil also hosts the largest economy in Latin America. Truly, if you've never looked into Brazil, you should. It is such an interesting place to look into and to learn about. From monkeys just roaming around the city to pink dolphins to 60% of the world's rainforests. Not only is Brazil one of the most culturally and ethnically diverse countries out there, it also has a massive variety of different ecosystems. Not to mention the largest number of different types of primates. Actually, if you combined Brazil's primate population with Madagascar's primate population, those two countries alone hold 40% of the world's living primate species. Sorry, I should probably rein it in with the fun facts, but like I said, this place really is just so freaking cool. For the sake of time though, let's narrow it down to Sao Paulo. Thought of as the world in a blender, Sao Paulo is a cultural melting pot with an incredibly rich immigration history, meaning that in one singularly beautiful place, there is the opportunity to see and experience history and culture from all over the world. And this makes Sao Paulo and just Brazil as a whole a very diverse and a very accepting place. Actually, Sao Paulo hosts the largest annual LGBTQIA+ festival in the entire world. Like, millions of people come from far and wide to join in on the festivities and to show their pride or to show their support. And while things like the festival are city type experiences, and Sao Paulo is an incredibly industrialized, like, big city, let me assure you that that does not take away from its beauty. Just beyond the city limits, you'll find hundreds of miles of tropical Atlantic coastline to behold. And then even within the city, there is still an undeniable beauty and charm. Not just thanks to the wonderful people who live there, but also thanks to some really incredible and thought-provoking street art. This, my friends, is the setting for our story today. And wow, do I have a story for you all today. Today, we're going to be discussing arguably the most well-known case in Brazil. If you're from the States, think JonBenet Ramsey or Casey Anthony. This is their equivalent to those. Research indicates that media coverage of this specific case reached 98% of Brazilians, which is the farthest media reach of any case before it. Y'all, that is like over 200 million people. It's fine. It's not a big deal. It's just no pressure at all.
Things are gonna be okay.
Today, we're going to be discussing the unbelievably tragic murder of Isabella de Oliveira Nardoni. Isabella was born on April 18th, 2002 to her parents Alexandre Alves Nardoni and Ana Carolina Cunha de Oliveira. It's gonna be another rough one this week.
That you want.
Isabella was the couple's only child together, and for the most part, that was due to the fact that pretty much right from the start, Alexandre and Ana Carolina's relationship was a mess. It was a IRL novela of sorts. The two met as teenagers. I believe they met in school, and despite their young age, their relationship progressed relatively quickly. Much quicker than I think either of them truly ever would have anticipated it would. By the time the two had been together for just a year and a half, Ana Carolina discovered that she was pregnant, and I think it's safe to assume that they were not planning, nor were they expecting this. Given their age and the short time that they'd been together, I'd be hard-pressed to believe that they'd put really much of any thought into starting a family at all. They were so young, and they weren't yet married, and probably most inconveniently, Alexandre was quite literally just about to begin law school. So to say that the timing was less than ideal, well, that would be a pretty serious understatement. This pregnancy definitely introduced a heightened level of stress to not just Ana Carolina and Alexandre's relationship, but it shook up Ana Carolina's entire family. You see, at the time that Ana Carolina fell pregnant, her brother and his wife were also expecting their first baby. And while cousins in such close age proximity sounds like a sibling's dream come true, for Ana Carolina's family, seeing her brother do things in the correct order, finish school, get married, then have a baby, well, I guess you could say that all that did was put a spotlight, if you will, onto some of the less than desirable circumstances surrounding Ana Carolina's relationship and her pregnancy. Because when I tell you that Ana Carolina and Alexandre's relationship wasn't perfect prior to the pregnancy, not even close. Sure, once they found out that they were going to be parents, they tried to pull it together. They tried to be happy. They even almost moved in together. But ultimately, Ana Carolina just felt as though their relationship was too unpredictable and too unstable to bring a child into under one roof. So although they did stay together for a while, Ana Carolina did ultimately decide to forego shacking up with Alexandre and instead opted to stay home at her parents' house once the baby came. And while in my opinion, this sounds like a really good decision, given that Alexandre sucks, it's also relatively common practice in Brazil. From what I was able to find, close to, I believe, a third of Brazilian residents live in a multi-generational type setup. And given her circumstances, I have to assume that Ana Carolina was incredibly grateful to have this option available to her. Because while her parents might not have been thrilled to find out about her pregnancy or thrilled about the circumstances surrounding it, they were still completely ready and willing to help and support her. And whoo, y'all, would she be needing that family support more than she ever would have thought in the years to come, for numerous reasons. Starting with, but not limited to, the fact that Alexandre, while Ana Carolina was practically bursting at the seams, pregnant with his baby, he was out starting a whole ass other relationship with a fellow classmate of his. Yes, a 23-year-old Alexandre Alves Nardoni with his whole ass pregnant girlfriend back home, and while supposed to be studying the law, was instead studying an 18-year-old peer of his. Now, ironically, this lady was also named Ana Carolina. Ana Carolina Chata Peixoto Jatoba. Yeah, Brazil got some long names. Luckily for them, they're a casual first name sort of people. Unlucky for us, though, we can't be first name people with the people in this story because of our two Ana Carolinas. Now, there is a remedy for that a little bit later in this video, but for now, to keep it from getting confusing, Ana Carolina 1, the good one, we'll keep calling her Ana Carolina, and Ana Carolina 2, the bad one, well, for now, we'll call her Ana Carolina Jatoba. Hopefully, that will help us all collectively keep things straight. Oh my god. You think he chose another Ana Carolina to make cheating easier? Like, keep himself from mixing up names, or you think it was just a coincidence? Personally, I I don't know how common that name is in Brazil, so I guess I'd have to crunch those numbers before I could make an educated guess, but I can say for sure that, coincidence or not, surely didn't make it any harder. Anyway, after crossing paths while the two were both studying law at Faculdades Integradas de Guarulhos,
Help me!
the two began a full-blown relationship, despite the fact that Alexandre was very much already involved in a completely separate full-blown relationship. Didn't I tell you that their relationship would make the perfect plot for a novela? Now, Anna Carolina and Alexandre might not have lived together, and she might have been completely preoccupied nearing the end of her pregnancy, but as women often do, she noticed almost immediately when Alexandre's demeanor shifted following the start of his affair with Ana Carolina Jatoba. I swear it must be a superpower that women have, because I feel like we can almost always pick up on like the slightest changes in our men. We got that gut instinct, that women's intuition, that sixth sense, you know? And like I said, Ana Carolina definitely had a visceral and all-consuming feeling that Alexandre was being unfaithful. Not surprisingly though, no matter how many times she confronted him with these suspicions, which she did on numerous occasions, surprise, surprise, he lied and denied it each and every time. And even though she never fully let her suspicions go, at the end of the day, she wanted to believe him. She wanted their relationship to survive, and she wanted the father of her baby to be there for both of them. But dude, can you imagine what poor Ana Carolina was going through? Being days away from giving birth and feeling so sure that your partner's out just slutting it up around town? I cannot think of anything that would or could make a woman feel worse. And remember, that's combined with all the stress she felt from the disapproval she knew her family was feeling. It was a really, really tough time for Ana Carolina. And it is definitely not how I assume she felt that her journey towards motherhood would begin. Thankfully though, the minute that everyone laid eyes on Isabella, all of that stress and all of that tension that everyone had been feeling over the preceding months, it all melted away instantly when that little girl entered this world. She was hands down, without a doubt, the most perfect, beautiful, amazing little girl they had ever laid eyes on. That's not surprising though, considering that she bared a striking resemblance to her mother from the moment she took her first breath, and Ana Carolina is also gorgeous. And Ana Carolina and her little baby daughter bonded instantaneously. Within minutes of them placing that baby on her chest, it was like they had known each other for years. And right in that very moment, Ana Carolina knew that this little girl was all that mattered to her. Unfortunately though, as far as Ana Carolina and Alexandre's relationship, well, bringing a baby into a relationship that's already hanging on by a thread, let's just say it ain't gonna fix it. Having a baby is hard, and those sleepless nights and fluctuating hormones, that can test and strain even the strongest relationships. So to introduce that kind of stress to a relationship that's already crumbling, it's the recipe for disaster. Ana Carolina and Alexandre, they were just not getting along, like, ever anymore. They were constantly fighting. Alexandre was getting more and more volatile. At times he threatened not just Ana Carolina, but members of her family. And that's all bad enough without even factoring in that Ana Carolina still felt like deep in her bones as though Alexandre was cheating on her, which he absolutely still was. And eventually, as the months kind of ticked on, frankly, Ana Carolina could not take it anymore. And by the time Isabella was just 11 months old, Ana Carolina broke things off with Alexandre, and she secured primary and almost full custody of Isabella. Alexandre did still see Isabella periodically. I'm not exactly sure of how often, but he did still see her some. And he also paid 250 reais to Ana Carolina per month in child support, which might sound semi-decent until you realize that that is like the equivalent of $50 USD. So he maybe saw her a few times a month, and he paid $50 in child support. Otherwise, Anna Carolina was Isabella's primary and sole carer, giving Alexandre plenty of time to start openly flaunting his new relationship with Anna Carolina Jatoba. Understandably, this new relationship did kind of rub Anna Carolina the wrong way. Not because she wanted Alexandre back. I'm sure she was thrilled that he was some other broad's problem now, but the relationship bothered her because of how quickly after their split it seemed to come about. I mean, let's be real, it never really looks good when someone is suspected of cheating and then before the dust settles on one relationship, they've already hard launched a new one. In my opinion, all that does is make it glaringly obvious that you were cheating. Now, like most freshly separated couples, Anna Carolina and Alexandre did have hopes that they could navigate a smooth and friendly co-parenting arrangement, but when Anna Carolina Jatoba entered the picture, things became strained. Anna Carolina definitely had her suspicions that Anna Carolina Jatoba was the other woman whom Alexandre had always promised her didn't exist. But unfortunately, no matter her opinions, given how quickly their relationship seemed to be moving, it really didn't look like she was going to have a choice other than to just let it be and to move past it. Within a year of Alexandre and Anna Carolina's separation, not only was he married to Anna Carolina Jatoba, but they were also expecting their first child together now. Isn't that just, like, I don't know, icky? To know that your ex's mistress is now your child's stepmom. As a mother myself, the thought of that,
I don't like that.
I mean, given how the relationship started, the woman clearly has loose morals and virtually non-existent family values. If she was totally willing to tear apart a family just to keep the scraps for herself, and now she's a part-time parent to your child, fuck that. But at the end of the day, what was Anna Carolina supposed to do? As indecent as the situation seemed, she can't control who her ex ends up with. Y'all, when me and my oldest's dad split, I cannot tell you the nightmares that I had about who he might end up with. And that's nothing to do with him. I'm just a worst case scenario type of gal, and I was prepared for the worst. Thankfully, I absolutely adore my son's stepmom. She's incredible. Honestly, I might like her more than my ex at this point. I'm just kidding, but damn, it is stories like this that really put into perspective how lucky my family and I are that we've been able to meld together so well with my oldest dad's family. Because while I might have the luxury of not recognizing it daily, I'm pretty sure we're the outliers. I don't think that the majority of separated parents get along with new spouses this well, especially not in this story. And by this point, Anna Carolina was forced to see Alexandre and Anna Carolina Jatoba on a regular basis. Their formal custody agreement worked out to Alexandre having Isabella 2 weekends every month. So from Friday night to Monday morning, twice every month. Meaning that, accounting for drop-offs and pickups, Anna Carolina was forced to be around these schmucks at least 4 times a month. And this was hard for Anna Carolina for more reasons than just she didn't like Alexandre and his new wife. She also didn't want to give this time up with her daughter. She would have loved nothing more than to have had Isabella fully and permanently without ever having to send her away to her father's ever again. The problem with that, though, was that deep down, she knew and she understood that it was important for Isabella to have a relationship with not just her father, but also with her new siblings. Alexandre and Anna Carolina Jatoba ultimately went on to have 2 children together, 2 boys, and Isabella absolutely adored her brothers. She was an incredible big sister. And actually, kind of an unexpected byproduct of Anna Carolina Jatoba having her own children was that it actually seemed to soften her opinion and her demeanor towards Isabella. At the beginning of she and Alexandre's relationship, well, you know, the public part of it, it was pretty obvious that Anna Carolina Jatoba resented Isabella. She clearly viewed her as a burden and almost as like an unnecessary relic from Alexandre's time with Anna Carolina. And this is something that will truly never not frustrate me. If you cannot love and accept someone's child that you are romantically involved with, you need to go and find someone else. It is so beyond disturbing to me when someone chooses to stay with a person who has a kid only to turn around and then mistreat said kid. Look, Everyone has a past. Everyone has had a romantic history before meeting the person they're going to end up with. So if you cannot accept your partner's baggage, whether it is a child or something else, the solution is quite simple. Don't be with that person. I get it. You might really, really like them. But if you cannot put the same effort into a positive relationship with their literal child that you can to a relationship with them, then you might not actually like that person as much as you think you do. And I'm sorry, but how self-aggrandizing of this person to think that her relationship with Alexandre is more important than his relationship with his daughter. It's deplorable. Even after Anna Karolina Jatoba and Alexandre's boys were born, yeah, things were better, but they still weren't, good. According to Anna Karolina's friends, Isabella would frequently come home from her weekends with her father in hysterical tears. On other occasions, she would beg to come home early, and then sometimes she would ask if she could just skip the visit altogether. Now, I don't have a lot of specific scenarios to reference as to why Isabella had such conflicting feelings towards spending time at her father's. All I can really do is speculate based off of what I know about he and Anna Karolina Jatoba. All I could find about the situation that was plainly spelled out was that Isabella just seemed to be much happier and much more comfortable and much more content when she was home with her mother. Putting aside the fact that Alexandre and Anna Karolina Jatoba are assholes, Isabella was also a very strong-willed and assertive little girl. And while her mother valued her strong personality, as any parent should, something tells me that it was likely not as well received by Alexandre and Anna Karolina Jatoba. Isn't that just so sad to think about? To think that her own father, for the benefit of his wife, tried to squander away his daughter's self-confidence and self-worth. Isabella sounds like an amazing and funny and smart little girl. And to know that she likely didn't feel valued by one of her parents, that kills me. This little girl at just 5 years old, her biggest goal and aspiration in life was to learn how to read and how to write. How cute is that? She was so ambitious already at such a young age, which, even though it's hard to say with any certainty, plus it might just be how invested in this case I've become over the last few weeks, but I don't know, man. I genuinely feel as though Isabella would have grown up to be a pretty remarkable young woman, had she been given the chance. Devastatingly, though, her life was violently and horrifically robbed from her before she ever really got a chance to live it, before she got the chance to grow up and to show the world what she was capable of. This poor little girl was ruthlessly killed before she ever even got the chance to read her first book or to write her first sentence. And y'all, when you learn the circumstances surrounding Isabella's death, trust and believe you will be just as enraged as all of Brazil was and is, because rightfully so, they still pissed about this. However, before we get into the exact specifics of what happened to Isabella, I first want to briefly talk to you about filicide. A term coined as far back as at least the 1800s, filicide is defined as the act of killing one's own child. And while it is an unfathomable concept to most of us now in modern times, it did not always used to be like that. In fact, in Greco-Roman times, fathers could kill their children without a single repercussion, just because they saw fit. That said, though, in modern days, staggeringly, mothers are actually statistically more likely to carry out these types of crimes. Think Andrea Yates, Diane Downs, Casey Anthony, Michelle Kehoe. The list truly and devastatingly goes on and on, as does the list of types of filicides, of which there are 5. There's altruistic, so think a mother that kills their child before, say, committing suicide. In their mind, they are saving their child from growing up motherless. There's fatal maltreatment, so think Lacey Fletcher. Her parents ignored her and neglected her for so long that she died and literally began to decompose and melt into their sofa. There's unwanted child, so think Diane Downs or Casey Anthony. Those were situations where their kids were just, cramping their style. Then there's acutely psychotic, so think Andrea Yates. I'm sure everyone's familiar, but if you're not familiar with her story, she drowned her 5 children as a result of postpartum psychosis. Then finally, there is spousal revenge. First case that comes to mind for this one for me is Ronald Shanabarger. This man killed his son to get back at his wife because he was mad at her that she didn't cut their vacation short when his father died. Yeah, it's an interesting phenomenon, and each category in and of itself has a list miles long. I wish that I could give more detailed and specific information and statistics on filicide throughout the world, especially since we are international today. But sadly, given the fact that the entities that are typically tasked with protecting children from these crimes are often understaffed and underfunded, well, it is just highly likely that these crimes are also underreported. And then that in turn makes it difficult to find much, if any, reliable data from other countries. What I can tell you though is that richer countries actually seem to have higher filicide case statistics. And leading the pack, the US. So we've got the market cornered on that, mass shootings, and serial killers. So we're doing really, really well up here. In all seriousness though, children are the world's most precious and most vulnerable population, yet somehow they face heinous and atrocious violence and exploitation all over the world. And what's even worse is that these crimes are mostly perpetrated by people who knew these children personally. People who have managed to gain children's trust, like teachers, coaches, family members, family friends. We are all taught about stranger danger growing up, but the harsh reality is that these crimes against children are more likely to happen in places where they think they're the most protected. And that's referencing just broad scale crimes against children, but bringing it back to filicide in particular, I personally think that this case encompasses two kinds of filicide. I'm not going to tell you what they are right now though. I'll specify later, like more towards the end of the video, because I want to give y'all time to form your own opinions first before I go cramming mine down your throat. For now though, let's discuss another phenomenon at play in this case, and that is the Cinderella effect. The Cinderella effect is the phenomenon of higher instances of child abuse and mistreatment by step-parents than by biological parents. Research suggests that because some step-parents may not feel as connected to their partner's child as they do to their own biological children, this can easily contribute to a dysfunctional family dynamic. Statistically speaking, violence and abuse between step family members is significantly more likely to occur than between biological family members. And this isn't to villainize all stepmothers or even all step-parents. My husband is a step-parent. My oldest's dad's wife is obviously also a step-parent. And I adore both of them. These are merely facts and statistics that I think are important and relevant to today's case. Now, what's really serendipitous about this whole Cinderella effect thing is that the Portuguese language actually comes in pretty clutch here with a perfect word to encompass the Cinderella effect as a whole. The Portuguese word for stepmother, madrastra, actually has an inherently negative connotation, meaning that it is the perfect word to henceforth brand Anna Carolina Jatoba. Remember how I said I'd eventually have a different name to call her? Yeah, this is that. It's happening now. Going forward, Anna Carolina, good. Love her. Madrastra, bad. We hate her. Good? Good. Well, good, not great, I suppose, because regretfully, it appears that I can stall no more. We have officially reached the evening of March 29th, 2008. Oh, actually, yes, I can. I can take my break and throw on my lashes now. After that, I can't stall, but for now, I did just buy myself at least a couple more minutes. Don't go nowhere. All right, so we're back, and like I said prior to our break, it was Saturday, March 29th, 2008, and per the custody agreement, it was one of the 2 weekends a month that Isabella was scheduled to be at Alexandre's. Now, as far as I know, the day was fairly typical, pretty uneventful. They spent the day running errands, they went to the supermarket, they visited the Madrastra's parents. They did all of this before arriving back to their home at the London Building apartment complex shortly after 11:30 p.m. Alexandre claims that Isabella had fallen asleep in the car on their way home, so he figured that the easiest way to get all of the kids up to their 6th floor apartment was to carry Isabella up first. He figured he'd bring her up, tuck her into bed, and then he would leave her alone in the apartment while he went back down to the garage to help the Madastra bring the other kids back up to the apartment. At this time, their two sons were 3 and 11 months old. According to the GPS in Alexandre's car, the engine was turned off right at 11:36 p.m. Then, cut to 15 minutes later, 190, which is the Brazilian equivalent to 911, they received a frantic call reporting that a little girl had fallen from a window onto the lawn outside the London Building apartment complex and was now lying unresponsive. Actually, over 50 emergency calls were made to 190 that evening, all regarding this specific incident at the London Building. And while not a single one of these calls were actually placed by Alexandre or the Madastra, in some of the calls, Alexandre can be heard screaming and carrying on in the background. And it was actually his hysterics in the background of other people's calls that emergency services first heard a detailed account of what had supposedly happened. According to Alexandre, when he and the Madastra arrived back up to the apartment with the other children, Isabella was gone. Every parent's worst nightmare, right? Realizing that their child isn't where they're supposed to be. I mean, that would be devastating. And the realization that she was gone could only be rivaled by Alexandre's realization that the safety screen on their window, the window of their 6th floor apartment, had been cut. And seeing this, Alexandre assumed that a burglar must have broken into the apartment, found Isabella, and decided to throw her from the apartment window in order to then rob the apartment. I mean, we all know what a threat a sleeping 5-year-old would pose to a burglar. They would have no choice but to heave her out a window rather than simply just tiptoeing around her. And as this story starts to unfold, you can hear the urgency and the terror just continue to mount in everyone's 190 calls. Because not only now was this little girl in serious medical danger, barely clinging to life after being thrown 6 stories, but now there is also apparently a madman on the loose in the neighborhood robbing houses and chucking babies out of windows. That is a bad night. As first responders made it to the scene, they were met by a group of neighbors who had actually gathered around Isabella to see if they could help her in any way until the paramedics arrived. Along with emergency medical personnel, police also came out in droves to respond to the scene. And immediately upon their arrival, they cordoned off the area in hopes of blocking in this supposed burglar, now attempted murderer. Their hope was that they could quickly trap them and apprehend them and bring them to justice. Ooh, and y'all, when I say that police presence was heavy, it was heavy. So many police had responded to the calls that by the time Anna Carolina arrived to the scene, she was barely even able to make it through to her daughter. She had received the call about the accident from the Madastra while she had been at a friend's barbecue that evening, and upon hearing that her daughter had been seriously injured, Anna Carolina immediately left the barbecue and she raced to the apartment to be by Isabella's side. Anna Carolina was so desperate to get to Isabella that she quite literally jumped out of her moving vehicle so that she could run through the police barricades and get to her daughter. And honestly, I don't even know how much of what was going on she really had time to process by the time she did take her place next to Isabella's side. All she had really gotten from the call with the Madastra was her repeating over and over again, she fell, she fell. So I think the only thing that Anna Carolina really cared about at that moment was the tiny shred of hope that she had in seeing that Isabella was still clinging to life. Sure, her breaths were slow and shallow, but she was breathing, so beyond that, at that moment, I don't really think that she was all that concerned with what had exactly happened. At that moment, she was too busy putting all of her energy into just hoping that her daughter would pull through. I mean, if Isabella had survived the fall, maybe she could survive the aftermath too. A very common Brazilian phrase is "A esperança vence o medo," which translates to hope conquers fear. And Anna Carolina was certainly putting all her energy into hope rather than into her fears. Meanwhile, police were still searching the area in mass for this burglar in black that Alexandre was so vehemently asserting was responsible for what had happened to his daughter. They searched the apartment common areas, they searched individual apartments, they searched the parking garage, they even searched a nearby construction site thinking that maybe the burglar had used this as an escape route or even as a hiding place, but big surprise, they found nothing. Once Isabella was stabilized enough for transport, she was taken to Santa Casa de Misericordia Hospital, which was just over 3 kilometers away from the apartment building. So roughly like 2-ish miles. And poor Ana Carolina, she wasn't even permitted to ride in the back of the ambulance with Isabella. She had to ride up front with the driver while Alexandre and Ana Carolina's parents followed the ambulance closely behind in their own cars. And like I said, the hospital wasn't that far from the apartment, meaning that especially with lights and sirens, the drive wasn't really all that long. But even so, Ana Carolina still felt as though it took an eternity. Once they did finally make it to the hospital, Ana Carolina and her parents and Alexandre were all forced to wait patiently in the hospital's waiting room to receive any updates regarding Isabella's condition. They sat in silence, just praying as hard as they could that somehow, miraculously, this little girl might be able to pull through. However, devastatingly, in the very early morning hours of Sunday, March 30th, they were informed that Isabella, just 5 years old, had succumbed to her injuries and she had passed away. Understandably, Ana Carolina was absolutely broken hearing this. She immediately collapsed onto the floor and she just sobbed. Her mother tried to comfort her and tried to console her, but I mean, I don't think there's anything you can say to someone in a moment like this to make them feel better. A parent is not supposed to outlive their child. It is the most unnatural phenomenon that could ever occur. It makes me sick to my stomach to even think about it. I mean, there's words for everything else, like a child who loses a parent, that's an orphan. A person who loses their partner, that's a widow or a widower. But there is no word defined by a parent losing their child. It's just not supposed to happen. And that is exactly what Ana Carolina was trying to comprehend. How could this be happening to her? How could she be at a friend's barbecue one minute, not a care in the world, and then somehow the next second she's at the hospital being given the absolute worst news she will ever receive? It really was just a complete and total whirlwind. About a week before this happened, Ana Carolina had actually visited a cemetery to say goodbye to a friend of hers who had recently passed. And while she was there, she happened to notice a tiny white casket being prepared for burial. And she was horrified at the reality that this casket represented. She couldn't help but get emotional and kind of choked up, thinking about the poor family of this child she didn't even know. She was devastated, thinking about what they were undoubtedly going through. And now, in a cruel twist of irony, in the wake of losing her own daughter, all she could think about now was that she was that mother. That casket would be her daughter and it would be her family. They were going to be the ones that other people were taking pity on. It was just devastating and confusing and surreal. She honestly didn't even know if Isabella had made it to the hospital alive or if she'd passed away in the ambulance before they even made it there. To this day, I still don't think she has that answer. I have no idea why she wasn't allowed to ride with her daughter on the way to the hospital. It's really frustrating if you think about it, but I guess it's also not really a point worth dwelling on now. Thankfully, she was permitted to see Isabella one more time at the hospital so that she could truly say goodbye to her, and I cannot even imagine how painful that must have been. You are supposed to have your entire life to tell your children everything you need to. But now Ana Carolina is expected to cram everything she wants to say to her baby in just a couple of minutes. Where do you even start? The only thing that Ana Carolina could manage to think to say to her daughter was that everything was going to be okay. She told her it was okay for her to move on, that it was okay for her to rest easy and to be at peace, and that no matter what, as her mother, she would take care of things here, earthside. And then, upon walking out of that hospital room, Ana Carolina was sentenced to a life of saudade. Saudade is a Portuguese word that literally cannot be translated to any other language. The closest definition that we can give it with the English language is an emotional state of melancholic or profoundly nostalgic longing for a beloved yet absent something or someone. And while that may not be the exact translation, because like I said, it really can't be translated, even that as close as it gets, translation is hauntingly beautiful. It truly is a perfect representation of exactly what Anna Karolina would now be living with every day for the rest of her life. A constant feeling of absence, a sadness for something that's missing, a wistful longing for completeness or wholeness, and a yearning for the return of something that is now gone. Oh, and as if she wasn't going through enough already, just as she was getting ready to leave the hospital with her parents, Anna Karolina was actually approached by police who requested that instead of heading home, they accompany them down to the station. And at first, this actually made Anna Karolina and her family pretty mad because, they were under the impression that this was like a massive, unfortunate accident. So was it really necessary that they deal with formalities now on the precipice of what is undoubtedly going to be the hardest time of their life? It really couldn't wait? Well, it turns out, no. And this, my friends, was actually the very first time that they were informed that Isabella's death was actually suspected to have been a homicide. Can you imagine? Like, it wasn't difficult enough thinking that this was an accident. Now she was faced with the notion that someone may have purposefully done this to her daughter. It was like the hits just kept on coming. And to put it frankly, Anna Karolina was furious with everything, but mainly she was angry with Alexandre. To clarify, she wasn't even mad because she thought he was directly responsible. At least not at this point. More than anything, I think that her anger towards him was due to the inherent responsibility that she believed he held, having been the one that was responsible for her at the time she was killed. And actually, upon agreeing to follow the police to the station and leaving the hospital, Anna Karolina, she never spoke a single additional word to Alexandre ever again. Even to this day, she has not spoken directly to this man since the night that her daughter died. Like I said, thinking that he'd been so irresponsible as to let their daughter fall out of a window accidentally was one thing, but it was a whole other thing to find out that he'd potentially left her in a position to be murdered. Because as crazy as it sounds, Isabella would have been far from the first child just in the news at the time to fall out of an apartment window. Actually, that was the reason that the Nardoni's apartment building was equipped with safety nets in the first place, to prevent an accident just like what Anna Karolina had initially believed this to be. It wasn't until they were told that the safety netting on the window Isabella had fallen from had been cut that they really processed, like, holy shit, someone did this. Someone threw her from this window. It was unbelievable. Yeah, crime rates in Brazil, they're pretty high in comparison to other countries. But most of the crime seen in Brazil is crime committed out of need. No matter what the crime rates are, people are not running around and throwing kids out of windows on the reg. Hence why police were so interested in speaking to not just Anna Karolina, but to her family and to Alexandre and the Madastra. Actually, Alexandre and his devil bride ended up going into the police station before Anna Karolina even did. They went in first with their fleet of defense attorneys. Police had simply called them in to get a more detailed timeline from them, like a point-by-point playthrough of everything that had happened that evening. Well, that and a family history and a list of possible enemies, people who might want to target them, but either way, why do you need a team of defense attorneys by your side for this? Sure, I get that it's their right, but you have to admit, it looks a little shady. And I am usually a huge proponent of keeping yourself safe by having representation, but I don't know. Something about having a strong legal team assembled just hours after this tragedy, it rubs me the wrong way. Nevertheless, in this initial conversation with police, the Nardonis actually went out of their way to implicate, of all people, their building's doorman. It's assumed that the only reason they pointed a finger at him was because he was wearing black, which is what Alexandre swore that the burglar had also been wearing. But unfortunately for the Nardonis, police were not convinced for even a second that this poor doorman could have possibly been guilty. He had been visibly shaken when they'd spoken to him at the scene, and although we always say that there's no right way to act in an emergency, the doorman did seem to be behaving appropriately given the situation at hand. He seemed to have acted appropriately throughout the entire ordeal. Very differently than Alexandre, who was calmly speaking to the press while the doorman comforted Anna Karolina. So again, there's no right or wrong way to act, but they're also, like, kinda is. And that's not even taking into consideration the fact that in Brazil, doormen are very well respected. They are thought of as trustworthy, good, hardworking people who, more often than not, actually act like unofficial backup guardians to the kids that live in their buildings. They keep an eye on the kids. They look out for them. They sometimes even babysit them. They are gems within their community, and the Nardoni's doorman was no exception. So he was ruled out as having anything to do with Isabella's death pretty much immediately. Even so, take the doorman out of the equation altogether, it did not take long for the Nardoni's story of this elusive burglar to start to crumble basically as quickly as they'd whipped it together. Just from a preliminary search of the apartment, police determined that there was no forced entry. The apartment hadn't been ransacked. Nothing had been stolen. A search of Alexandre's car actually turned up Isabella's blood. Her blood was also found dripped through the apartment, suggesting that she'd actually been injured before she'd even made it into the apartment. And probably one of the biggest inconsistencies in the Nardoni story was just the timeline in general. 15 minutes is a very short time frame to assume that a burglar would choose the apartment to enter, attempt to find valuables, discover Isabella, find scissors, cut the safety net, throw her out, and then flee before the Nardonis return to the apartment. Simply put, the math, as the kids say these days, it just did not seem to be mathin', my friends. That said though, even though their story was suspicious, to say the least, police did still want to tread incredibly lightly with their investigation because although they were growing increasingly suspicious of the couple, they also didn't want to prematurely cast public doubt or suspicion onto potentially innocent grieving parents, let alone wrongfully detain or arrest them. But the more they investigated and the more that came to light, the harder it became to discount the theory that these people, Alexandra and the Madastra, it really looked like they were responsible for what had happened to Isabella. Every single thing they did in the wake of her death made them look so unbelievably suspicious. They were evasive when answering, tough questions. Their stories were identical, which made them come across as rehearsed. And while all of that is bad enough, what really bothered everyone was that they just seemed too stuck on their own innocence. They didn't seem to care at all about losing Isabella or about getting her justice. They were just hell-bent on adding this burglar back to the narrative. And we've already touched on the extensive defense team that they managed to trudge up less than 12 hours after Isabella's tragic and unexpected death. Now, surprisingly, one of the people close to the case that wasn't suspicious of Alexandra and the Madastra was actually Anna Carolina. Sure, she and the Madastra had their differences over the years, but as previously mentioned, things had seemed to have leveled out. She genuinely seemed to have matured since having her two boys. Anna Carolina truly could not fathom that Isabella's own father and stepmother could possibly be to blame for her death, regardless of how prepared they were to deal with this supposed tragic accident. And honestly, I can't say that I blame her. To think of having to come to terms with the fact that someone you used to love could have turned out to be such a deplorable monster, that at one point you were involved with someone capable of doing something so disgustingly heinous, it gives me goosebumps to think about how all of this may have been affecting her, mentally. It's no wonder she didn't want to believe that Alexandre could be responsible. The general public, on the other hand, they took much less convincing. As soon as news of what had happened to Isabella started to spread, and I'm talking within the first few days, Alexandra and the Madastra were guilty within the court of public opinion, for better or for worse. Isabella's case had become a media sensation, and even now, almost 20 years later, it still stirs up immense anger in most Brazilians. At the time that all of this was playing out, Alexandra and the Madastra, they couldn't go anywhere without being judged and chastised and, side-eyed. What's unfortunate, though, is that intense, life under a microscope thing, that extended beyond the couple. Anna Carolina also could not leave her house in the wake of Isabella's death without a camera being almost instantly shoved in her face. This poor woman was just trying to grieve and to heal after the most devastating experience of her life, but instead she's being constantly reminded of the nightmare that she was truly living. And sadly, this is an all too common problem with the media. And not just in Brazil, but everywhere. Everyone is so hard up to put out the newest, hottest, most salacious story faster than everyone else. And in turn, it's like they start to lose their humanity along the way. You know, after so long in this rat race, they start to see no issue in pushing these otherwise very normal boundaries. And then taking a less emotional and more pragmatic stance on the media circus, think of the threat that this can pose to the investigation itself. The media in this case had branded the Nardonis as guilty, and they were going so far as to discuss possible sentences before charges were even filed. Shoot, they had them halfway to the gallows in the news before the investigation had even really made any headway. And while I am very aware that there is like a almost gut instinct to want to think like, well, they're clearly guilty, so who cares? Trust me, I hate these people. But again, taking emotion out of the equation, we all know that this is a dangerous precedent to set. Anywhere. Whether we like it or not, everyone deserves to have a fair and unbiased trial. So it's dangerous for the media to perpetuate such strong opinions so early on. Because once that momentum gets going strongly enough, it becomes very difficult for police to navigate an effective investigation around all these preconceived notions. But difficult or not, police had to press on with their investigation, which they did. And as you'd likely expect, as said investigation progressed, it did nothing but continue to make Alexandra and the Madastra look guilty as hail. Truly, the more they dissected this case and looked around the scene, things just did not add up. So I already mentioned that there had been blood in the Nardonis' car, as well as droplets of blood throughout their apartment, but that was just the beginning. To elaborate, the Nardonis' apartment, rank. It was so messy and so packed to the brim with bullshit that you might actually think that it would make it hard to focus and to collect evidence. But in a way, it actually made things a little easier. And what I mean by this is that if the apartment is overall hella messy, and then someone tries to clean certain areas of it up, those areas, they're gonna stick out like a sore motherfucking thumb. For example, there were piles and piles and piles of dirty diapers scattered all around the Nardonis' apartment. And to clarify, I'm not talking like a pamper, I'm talking like cloth diapers, which to my understanding is more common in Brazil. So there are like these dirty, balled up cloth diapers everywhere, which made the one diaper sitting in a bucket of water, as if it was being cleaned, stand out. As did the fact that the water in said bucket seemed to be tinged a blood color. Investigators also found scissors in the Nardonis' sink that were eventually determined to have been the very scissors used to cut the safety netting on the window. So yeah, it looked bad. Oh, I almost forgot. Isabella's bed. It was perfectly, crisply, and neatly made. And not just made, but it was also covered in toys and stuffed animals and some of her recent drawings, essentially proving that there was no way that Alexandra had ever actually tucked her into bed the night she died, as he'd claimed he had. Additionally, Isabella's post-mortem exam revealed bruising on her neck consistent with strangulation, a fractured wrist, and a cut on her forehead that is assumed to be the origin of the blood they found in the car and in the apartment. They also spoke to some of the Nardonis' neighbors who claimed to have heard yelling in the apartment right before all hell broke loose on the ground floor. And this was important because it completely contradicted Alexandra's story, because why would there have been yelling in the apartment when, according to his story, Alexandra was at that very moment lying his sleeping daughter down to go to bed. The physical evidence in this case just did not seem to match up to the story that the Nardonis were trying to paint, nor did the timeline that police were slowly piecing together. 3 days into the investigation, the police announced that they had been able to successfully reconstruct about 70%, give or take, of Isabella's final day alive. And basically what it showed was that the Nardonis, they were big fat liars. According to police, the timeline of the evening went a little something like this. The Nardonis pulled into the London Building's parking garage sometime just after 11:30. Then the GPS in Alexandre's car recorded that the vehicle's engine was shut off right at 11:36 p.m. A few minutes later, neighbors claimed to have heard loud yelling coming from within the Nardonis' apartment. And then at 11:49, the doorman reports having heard a crash, which he then called the building manager to report. Then, less than a minute later, at 11:50, the building manager called to report what he believed to be a car crash to the police, completely unaware that simultaneously numerous other residents of the apartment building were also frantically calling the police to report what had actually happened, which was Isabella's fall. And then, finally, at 11:50 and a couple of seconds, Alexandre shows up on the lawn screaming about what had happened to his daughter. And we know this exact timing because, as previously discussed, his hysterics were recorded in the background of some of the different 190 calls. Basically, if Alexandre's story had been true, the timeline suggested that he and the Madastra got their kids up to the apartment, noticed Isa was gone, deduced she'd been thrown from the window, leading Alexandre to abandon his kids and his wife, leaving them potentially at the mercy of this crazed lunatic, before he then ran down 6 flights of steps, all in less than 1 minute. Look out, Usain Bolt. There's a new fastest man on the planet. The amount of time that police couldn't account for was so incredibly tight that every additional minute, or really every additional second that they were able to account for, well, wasn't making the Nardonis look any better. That's for sure. Between police suspicion and public pressure and scrutiny, police actually began to fear that rather than risk being arrested, the couple actually might try to flee. And while I certainly wouldn't put it past them necessarily, I also don't think that there was anywhere in Brazil that they could have gone where they wouldn't have been quickly tracked down or recognized or even subject to vigilante justice. But rather than risk it, the police did ultimately decide to temporarily arrest the couple in order to keep them in one place, and also kind of in an effort to keep them safe. And damn, did it take a heavy police presence to arrest and to transport these friggin' goons. As word spread that they'd been arrested, people lined the streets just waiting for a chance to scream at the couple. People called them murderers, among other things, and they demanded justice for Isabella. It truly seemed as though the entirety of Brazil was loudly and proudly standing behind this little girl. In such a short span of time, she had become the whole country's honorary daughter. When she was laid to rest in Parque dos Pinheiros, or Pine Park Cemetery, hundreds of people came out to attend her service and to support her family and to pay their respects to her. Even to this day, people of Brazil still hold a special place in their hearts for Isabella. But as much as they loved Isabella, wow, did they hate the Nardonis. People were absolutely giddy to see them arrested. Sure, it wasn't justice yet, but it definitely felt like at least a consolation prize. Alexandre and the Madastra were not formally charged upon their arrest. Like I said, they were only being held temporarily pending the end of the investigation, but ironically, their arrest actually put a clock on the investigation. From the point they were arrested, the police had 30 days to either release them or to charge them. Not that there wasn't already an inherent pressure on them from the public to solve the case quickly, but yeah, now there was a tangible, concrete deadline to take into consideration. But 30 days is a decent amount of time, right? Well, imagine Brazil's surprise when they were released after being held for just a week. Yeah, people were pissed, especially when they were seen walking out of the jail, smiling and laughing as if they were headed to an impromptu little day date. I'm sorry, but your daughter is dead, and you and your crusty wife are the #1 suspects in her murder? The fuck you got to be so damn happy about? I mean, if they were really trying to play the, grieving parent role that they swore they were living, couldn't they have at least pretended to be sad? It's very much giving Casey Anthony out clubbing and getting garbage tattoos while her daughter was missing. It's like they simply could not help themselves from destroying whatever public image they still had left. They were truly making quite the spectacle of themselves, and honestly, it kind of seemed like police were encouraging it. Alexandra and the Madastra were scheduled for a formal interrogation on April 18th, 2008. And if you've really been paying attention, you'll recognize that this was actually Isabella's 6th birthday. And while this was supposedly completely coincidental, I do not buy that it was not done purposefully in an attempt to elicit emotion. And that's not just emotion from the couple, but it's also emotion from the public as well, which it absolutely did. Just like when they were arrested, tons of people showed up outside of the police station on the day that their interrogation was scheduled with flowers and posters and balloons, all for Isabella. Some stood outside and sang happy birthday to Isabella, while others stood and yelled condemnations and obscenities at Alexandra and the Madastra. And when I say that police were seemingly encouraging these mobs of people to gather, what I mean is that it kind of seemed like they not only expected them to gather, but that they wanted to make them comfy. Like, they went so far as to put porta potties outside of the building so that people would be less likely to have to leave, or less likely to relieve themselves on the sidewalk, but nevertheless, they put them there. I mean, throw in some lions and you've basically got yourself a modern day Coliseum. And while this did sort of insinuate whose side police were on, the public was still very weary. Alexandre was a wealthy, entitled, cocky, spoiled brat. People were scared that because of his status and his resources, that he would be able to easily skirt responsibility for what everyone was so sure that he had done. Even with as obvious as it seems to you or to me, you have to understand that Brazilian people, they have a very complex history with their police, and it actually stems all the way back to the Cold War. Yeah, although you don't hear about it much, Brazil actually went through a lot during the span of the Cold War. Am I done? God damn, I finished this makeup fast. I still got like half the video to go. Okay, so to give you an extremely high-level overview, on March 13th, 1964, Brazilian President João Goulart announced his newest reform plan, a plan that included, but was not limited to, extending voting rights to the illiterate, nationalization of oil refineries, and expropriation of agricultural land next to railways and highways. So, given the political climate of the time, it should go without saying that these socialist economic measures, they really pissed off the conservative opposition. Even before this, tensions had been brewing in Brazil for years at this point, and this reform plan really turned up the heat on the metaphorical pressure cooker, you could say. With growing opposition among the elite, the urban middle class, a large portion of the officialdom, the Catholic Church, the press, all of these groups believed that João Goulart was threatening the legal order, that he was colluding with communism and inciting social chaos, and they thought that he was single-handedly breaking down the military hierarchy. Honestly, with this much tension, a coup d'etat was almost inevitable. What you might not be expecting, though, is that the good old US of A actually played a heavy hand in aiding the rebellion in said coup. Yeah, President Lyndon Johnson, upon catching wind of all this, went on to authorize Operation Brother Sam, which was in direct aid to the Brazilian opposition. We, as in America, provided arms, ammo, and crowd control gas to the rebellion in hopes of preventing Brazil from drifting any closer to what we perceived to be communism. And with these things at their disposal, in the early hours of March 31st, 1964, it all came to a head. João Goulart was overthrown, the Fourth Brazilian Republic came to a screeching halt, and for the next 2 decades, Brazil was held under a massively oppressive military dictatorship. And look, obviously, I don't think that anything about military dictatorship sounds like peaches and rainbows, but I truly need you to understand that this was 20 years of absolute hell on earth for the people of Brazil. The right to vote, to have opinions, to habeas corpus, all suspended. People were thrown in jail for anything and everything that the Polícia Civil saw fit. Artists, writers, poets, singers, and scholars were all thrown into jail for absolutely no reason. It was truly a living nightmare, all at the hands of the police and all basically sponsored by the United States. A complete and total grotesque disregard for people's lives, all in an effort to maintain some semblance of power. Again, this is an unbelievably simplified and watered down version of what all went on, but I do think it helps to at least understand why Brazilians struggle so deeply to trust the police. They have either seen firsthand or heard stories of the horrific atrocities carried out by the Polícia Civil over Brazil's 21-year military dictatorship. Basically, it taught them that if you have money or influence, you can kind of get away with anything. And maybe that explains why Alexandre and the Madastra seemed so blasé about this whole situation. Perhaps they truly believed that they were above the law and that Daddy Nardoni would do as he always had and make their little problem disappear. Actually, a journalist that was covering this case summed up the relationship between Alexandre and his father really well, stating, quote, "From my experience working with the police, I've come to realize that the father of the perpetrator will defend his child until his death. The mother, on the other hand, will take her child straight to the police. The mother says she brought her child because they need to learn their lesson, while the father hides the child under the bed." And I will be damned if Antonio Nardoni hadn't spent the previous 30 years at this point bailing his son out of trouble and helping him dodge any and all consequences of his actions. This is likely why within minutes of Isabella's fall, the Madastra was on the phone with her prominent defense attorney father-in-law rather than the police. And I also don't need to stretch to make the leap in assuming that this is how the Nardonis managed to pull together their giant legal team so quickly. Antonio was more so Alexandre's PR manager at this point than he really was a father, so why wouldn't the couple think that he was going to be able to bail them out? Why should things be any different this time than they had been all of the other times that Antonio made something disappear? Well, I actually have an answer for that, and it's because, for whatever reason, Isabella's case seems to have been the breaking point for the people of Brazil. A collective moment in which everyone came together, they put their foot down as a country, and they said, not this time. The minds of the people had already been made up. I don't think anyone at this point could have reversed the awful public image that everyone now had of Alexandre and the Madastra, despite the facade they tried so desperately to present. A facade that police were quickly dismantling. All this time, they'd been acting like the perfect couple. Alexandre had been acting like the best husband in the world and this all-star Hall of Fame father, but over the course of the Nardoni's 20-hour investigation, that fell apart quick. In actuality, Alexandre was mean, he was angry, he was hostile and aggressive, he was abusive to Ana Carolina as well as the Madastra, and even once he went so far as to threaten to kill Ana Carolina's mother. And then pivoting back to his relationship with Isabella, or really lack thereof, he was seriously like the least invested father imaginable. He didn't know what Isabella was interested in, he didn't know who her teachers were, couldn't name her pediatrician, he probably couldn't have even taken a stab at her favorite color. He was so seemingly disinterested in having any kind of real relationship with his daughter that I honestly don't even understand why he maintained his portion of their custody agreement to begin with. It was all very eye-opening to police, as was everything they started to uncover about Alexandre and the Madastra's relationship, which was that it wasn't great either. Truth be told, they both sucked. Probably always will. From the time they had started seeing each other in college, Ana Carolina was jealous and clingy and insecure. Probably because she knew she was dating someone who wouldn't hesitate to cheat. And as we've discussed in other videos, you're gonna lose him how you got him. And then Alexandre, I mean, what's really left to say? The man was an ass. He and the Madastra fought constantly, sometimes so loudly that people passing by on the street could literally hear the two of them hurling obscenities at each other. Sounds like a real stable environment to be raising 3 kids in, am I right? But putting all of that aside for now, as they sat in the police station under interrogation, I will give it to them, they stuck together. No matter what direction police took the questioning, they vehemently denied having any part in what had happened to Isabella. But vehement denial or not, surprisingly, somehow they actually managed to leave that interrogation looking worse than they had before, if you can even believe that. And I don't know if they were spiraling from there or if they truly thought that they were doing well for themselves, but regardless, they apparently still were not done digging their own graves. Yeah, just 2 days after the interrogation, the couple actually agreed to go on a very popular talk show to discuss everything. They wanted to talk about everything that had happened from their point of view. Mind you, they were in the interrogation for almost 24 hours. So they basically agreed to do this show like a day after leaving the police station. At the time the Nardonis appeared on it, Fantástico was one of the top shows in Brazil. It was broadcast on the Globo network, which also happened to be the largest media conglomerate in Brazil at the time. That said, though, scorned by what they've been through historically, people's enjoyment and their trust in Globo has started to wane over the years, given that they've gradually become more of a propaganda tool for whomever's in power than like an impartial media network. And as I'm sure you can understand, this worries people because without a complicit media willing to gaslight the masses, there's no military dictatorships, there is no Stalin, there's no Hitler. We see it here in the States all the time. Media willing to divide the masses in order to redirect their anger at each other rather than where it truly belongs. But without getting too off track, at the time our story takes place, the station was highly trusted, the show was highly rated, and for whatever reason, the couple thought that if given a large audience, these fools really thought that they could talk their way out of the crosshairs. I really don't know how they thought this was going to go or if they really thought this was going to benefit them, but whatever they were expecting, I can assure you the true outcome fell very, very short. Just from the clips I've seen, it was very much giving Chris Watts and his porch interview. Just the fakest, most phone-it-in grief you ever did see. They came off incredibly unlikable, and in the span of one singular interview, they managed to turn the very few supporters they still had totally against them. Honestly, though, it wouldn't have mattered if they could have said or done anything to change people's opinions on them at that point, because by the time they appeared on that show, police were hard at work solidifying their case against them. They already had a pretty decent amount of physical and circumstantial evidence to support their case, so all they really needed to do now was piece it all together in a way that a jury would find easy to comprehend and easy to digest. Basically, they had the package, they just needed to wrap it up all pretty, make it painfully clear that beyond a shadow of a doubt, the Nardoni story, it did not make sense. And the way they decided to pull this off was by conducting a real life, simulation recreation of what had happened the night that Isabella died. But they were also hoping that if by chance they were missing anything, doing this might help bring their attention to whatever that may be. The recreation was scheduled for Sunday, April 27th, 2008, and actually investigators invited the Nardonis to participate. They called them up, they told them what they were going to be doing, and they gave them the chance to join them and to show them exactly how they claim that everything went down. Shockingly, they declined. I say that with an unhealthy amount of sarcasm, but in all honesty, that was probably the first smart thing that they've done this whole time. I don't think any legal professional would advise that someone voluntarily demonstrate to police how their story doesn't add up worth a damn. Ooh, you know who did agree to recreate the night their children died? Diane Downs. Any guesses how that went?
4 days after her 7-year-old daughter was killed, Downs is filmed reenacting the attack. Downs seems lighthearted, giggling, even fixing her makeup.
Unfortunately for the Nardonis, though, again, said with a heavy amount of sarcasm. Much like their absolutely stacked legal defense team, their decision not to participate in this exercise once again piqued people's suspicions. It was another double-edged sword, if you will. Sure, they were doing what they needed to do to protect themselves, while simultaneously casting even more doubt onto themselves. To be 100% fair, though, I wouldn't have agreed to do it either, whether I was guilty or innocent. Because think about it. If you're guilty, like I said, submitting to doing this is doing nothing but risking incriminating yourself more. And then if you're innocent, there is no way in hell that you're going to voluntarily choose to relive the single worst night of your life. It just seems like an awful idea any way you slice it. They were well within their rights to decline participation, which obviously they did, and like I said, it was probably the first and only smart thing they did throughout this entire time frame. They got enough issues with the media without voluntarily serving themselves up on a silver platter, especially given the media circus that this exercise was definitely going to be. Police did try to mitigate the media coverage of the reconstruction by blocking off a pretty significant radius around the Nardoni's apartment building, but I think we all know that media personnel in any country can be just as creative as they can be cutthroat. One way or another, they were going to get the coverage that they wanted. And the way they ended up doing it was actually by renting out apartments in surrounding buildings to ensure that they would have a front row seat. Ironically, they actually ended up getting better views of this thing than they would have if they'd just been simply allowed to spectate from the street to begin with. But nevertheless, despite the media managing to infiltrate things, although police had done their best to keep them away, and despite the Nardoni's refusal to participate in it, the reenactment was conducted exactly as planned. Police spent 10 hours working through numerous different possible scenarios, all of which resulted in one unwavering conclusion. The evening of Isabella's death, it did not play out the way that the Nardonis were insisting it had. According to investigators' experiments, if Alexandre and the Badastra were in the parking garage like they claimed to have been when Isabella was thrown, it would have taken them close to 10 minutes to get up to their apartment, realize what had happened, and then make it back down to the ground floor again. But if you'll remember, according to Alexandre's story, it took him less than 60 seconds. Yeah, the couple was arrested pretty quick after the reenactment. Alexandre Alves Nardoni and Ana Carolina Trata Picciotto Jatoba were arrested, charged, and brought into custody late in the evening on May 8th, 2008, sometime around 10:30. And while that might sound like a pretty late time for an arrest, it actually really wasn't. Brazilians are night owls. They typically don't even sit down to eat dinner until sometime between like 7 and 9 p.m. So while initially to an American like me, the timing of the arrest may sound like it was done again in an effort to mitigate media coverage, but let me tell you, it most certainly was not. Like I said, Brazilians are night owls. So not only would it have been unrealistic to think that 10:30 would be late enough to bring them in discreetly, but police actually removed the standard issue tint from the arresting vehicle windows prior to heading out to bring the couple in. So not only did this allow for like unprecedented photos of Alexandre and the Madastra's transport, but then once they had them at the police station, they deliberately left them in the car with the doors wide open, exposed like sitting ducks, all for the benefit of the media. When I tell you that this case was like a whole ass cultural movement. I made mention of Casey Anthony and John Benet Ramsey at the beginning of this video, so just imagine how balls to the walls crazy we would be going up here in the States if those cases were teetering on the brink of being solved or of actually being prosecuted properly. People would be wilding out, and that is exactly how hard this hit the people of Brazil. People had been waiting for this and demanding this since damn near day one. The media had branded them guilty from the start, so people were pissed that the judicial system was taking so long to catch up. As time goes on and information becomes more readily and easily available to us, it's almost as if our desire and let's call it what it is, the entitlement we feel to certain information continues to grow. We have become so accustomed to having the world at our fingertips that when we don't get the answers we want or the resolutions we want when we want them, we get pissed. And this is like a collective we, like as the people of Earth, not something that I'm insinuating is specific to this case. To bring it back to the States, think of the Gabby Petito case. People were positive that Brian Laundrie was guilty pretty much from jump, media included. But it took so long for police to put a case together that by the time they were able to do anything, it was too late. And while, hell yeah, that can be so unbelievably frustrating, waiting for the system to navigate all of its red tape, the truth is that the media and the investigation, they're always going to move at two different speeds. Trying to accelerate the investigative process to appease the growing need for faster, exclusive, more salacious information, it's dangerous. That might sound dramatic, but realistically, all it can stand to do is to lead to mistakes or mishandling of forensic analysis or evidence. Worst case scenario, it could lead to someone guilty going free or someone innocent spending their life behind bars. As difficult as it may be for us to come to terms with, the bottom line is that law and order will never move at the same pace as the media. It simply does not and should not work like that. Now, ironically, you would think that the immense media pressure and public pressure surrounding this case would have made the prosecution want to expedite things and to move as fast as possible. But actually, it did the opposite. The prosecutor actually flat out said point blank that had the case not become the absolute sensation that it had, he would have been ready to go to trial by no later than July of 2008. But because he knew how many eyes would be on it, he instead spent 2 full years getting things in order, just crossing his T's and dotting his I's. The Nardoni trial officially began on March 22nd, 2010, just 1 week shy of the 2-year anniversary of Isabella's death. And surely I don't need to clarify this, but it was indeed every bit the spectacle you'd imagine it to be. The streets were absolutely flooded with spectators, some of whom had traveled hundreds of miles to be there or even camped out overnight just to be present. It's giving early 2000s Black Friday, and I'm like low-key here for it. It was amazing to see so much support for Isabella and for her family. Please don't think that for 1 second that is lost on me. But playing devil's advocate, given how involved the entirety of Brazil was in this case, by the time it was taken to trial, how realistic do you think it is that they actually managed to scrape up an unbiased jury? These people had seen and heard countless stories of innocent people, their innocent people having their own rights trampled on. So they came to view Alexandre and the Madastra as the embodiment of all of the injustices that had been done to their people over the preceding decades. Don't get me wrong, they really weren't shy about their prioritization of getting justice over getting a fair trial for these monsters, but realistically, because the vast majority of the country had become so invested in this case, they would have had to have it on a different planet to find an unbiased jury. And again, I think most of the blame for this falls back onto the media. There is a fine line between reporting on current events and slandering someone's name and ruining their chance at a fair trial. And like it or not, I think it's safe to say that with this one, the media definitely overstepped their bounds. And I get it, these people are clearly scum. It is beyond easy to want to just dismiss all of this and not care. But if it's allowed to happen to the Nardonis and we start normalizing allowing this to happen, someday it's going to be innocent people that it's happening to again. Don't lose sight of the fact that this did happen to innocent people for decades. I just think that allowing this type of media blitz in modern times especially, I think it's a dangerous precedent to set. Even the couple's defense attorney knew he was fighting a losing battle. He walked into the courthouse to his own personal chorus of boos, so you just know he wasn't feeling too optimistic. Once the trial had gotten rolling and opening statements had been made, Ana Carolina was the first official witness called. During her testimony, she explained that the Madastra had always been extremely jealous of her. She told the court about the time that Alexandre had threatened to kill her and her mother. She spoke of a time that he threatened to take off with Isabella once when she'd confronted him about a late support payment. And then the cherry on top, she told the court all about how during the phone call that she had with the Madastra on the night that Isabella died, Ana Carolina Jatoba had the audacity and just the unmitigated gall to insinuate that Isabella's death was her own fault. Yeah, dude. These fucking people. It was extremely difficult for Ana Carolina to take the stand and to speak out in front of the court, talking through point by point the most painful thing that she has ever endured, but she did it, and she did it so fucking well. Not only did she come bursting at the seams with information that made the Nardonis look even trashier than they already had, but she refused to even look at them while she testified. She walked into the courtroom with her head held high. She walked straight past them without so much as acknowledging their presence. She took her seat, and for the entire time that she testified, she remained laser focused on her task at hand. She was there solely to secure justice for she and her daughter. She spoke for hours, covering anything and everything that the prosecution and the defense could have possibly needed from her. Undoubtedly, she had given them more than enough to work with. However, when it comes to court in Brazil, before a witness can be dismissed, both the prosecution and the defense must agree that they're done with them. If one or both of the parties object to the witness's dismissal, then the witness has to be sequestered until both sides can agree that nothing further is needed from said witness. You can probably see where I'm going with this. While the prosecution voted respectfully to dismiss Ana Carolina, the defense requested that she be held until further notice. Yeah, rightfully so. This really, really pissed people off. Now, the defense did try to say that they did this for the benefit of Ana Carolina, but in my opinion, they can blow that out their ass, respectfully. They can tout around all they want that they were trying to protect her, but everybody saw right through this move for the dirty, low-down play that it was. They didn't want the jury to be emotionally affected by Anna Karolina throughout the trial. So rather than allow her to be present for the seeking of justice for her murdered child, they chose to lock her in a room and treat her like a criminal. Isn't that unfucking believable? Anna Karolina ultimately ended up being sequestered alone in a little concrete room for 3 days before she was finally released after a psychiatric assessment showed that being held like this was causing her extreme emotional distress. Look, I get that the defense attorneys have a job to do and that they're gonna do whatever they have to do to try to get the outcome that their client is paying them for, but you cannot sit here and tell me that what they did to Anna Karolina was not like the slimiest, most underhanded move that they could have possibly pulled. Even if watching the trial was going to be extremely difficult for her, watching her child's last excruciating minutes on earth be dissected over and over by witnesses and medical examiners and forensic experts and lawyers, the choice to do so or not should have been hers and hers alone. They should not have been allowed to rob her of that option. But instead of being surrounded by a support system of family and friends during this undoubtedly trying time, she was instead locked away like a prisoner and robbed of the chance to watch her daughter get the justice she deserved. By the time she was finally released, which the fact that I have to say that, bitch, my flabbers are gasted, but this poor woman was so traumatized that once she was out, she couldn't even handle being at the courthouse anymore. She mentally just could not take it, and so she didn't even get to see firsthand her daughter's killers be brought to justice. And that is just so sad and infuriating to me. The only, silver lining, I guess you could take away from this, is that the defense's plan to keep Anna Karolina from somehow influencing the jury, well, that shit completely backfired on them. Anna Karolina's room actually ended up being right next to the jury's room, meaning that, well, sure, they couldn't see her during court during the day. They could sure as shit hear her sobbing through the walls late into the night, though. A sound that surely haunted the jurors then, and likely still hasn't fully left them to this day. So I guess there's that. Anyway, meanwhile, while Anna Karolina was sequestered, the prosecution got to deliver their argument, which was very well put together and, in turn, very compelling. They had a polished timeline, they had clear and concise physical and circumstantial evidence, they had a 3D animation to show exactly how they believed the crime had played out. Baby, they milked every minute of those 2 years that they had to prep for this trial. According to Dr. Rosangela Monteiro, criminal expert, the evening of March 29th, 2008 went something like this. We know based on the information obtained from Alexandre's car's GPS system that the family arrived home to the apartment sometime between 11:30 and 11:40. It's speculated that at this point, these 3 young children, they were tired, they were hot, they were frustrated. Maybe Isabella was fighting with one of her younger brothers. Nothing malicious, just sibling stuff, of course. But it's assumed that from there, all hell broke loose within that car. The Madastra became enraged. She turned around and struck Isabella with her keys in an effort to shut her up. They think that's where the gash on her forehead came from. So now she's bleeding, she's crying. They've got to do something. So Alexandre grabs a clean cloth diaper, presses it to Isabella's wound, and then carries her to the apartment. Contrary to Alexandre's story, though, he did not leave the Madastra and their boys in the car to wait for him to help them to the apartment. Rather, they followed closely behind he and Isabella. It's then theorized that Isabella was strangled into unconsciousness once they arrived at the apartment, maybe in an effort to squelch her crying. And this is proven by her bloody clothes, suggesting that she was sitting still for quite some time after she'd been injured. Given Alexandre's history of volatility and violence, it is believed that Isabella's fractured wrist was actually caused by her father jerking her around. But as far as who strangled Isabella, well, long nail indentations on her neck suggest that Anna Karolina Jatoba was responsible for that portion of the attack. Alexandre had very short and bitten down nails in comparison to Anna Karolina's long manicured ones, so it was pretty easy to make the determination as to who had wrapped their grubby little hands around that poor baby's throat that night. The prosecution also noted blood on the bottom of Alexandre's shoes, suggesting that he was like passively at the crime scene, doing more walking around than anything, while blood on the top of the Madastra shoes suggested that she had been in very close proximity to Isabella when she had been actively bleeding. Assumably, the couple believed that she was dead post-strangulation and decided to throw her out the window and then tell people it was an accident. They likely assumed that if this whole thing was viewed as a tragic accident, that any and all marks on Isabella would be overlooked, as if they'd come from the fall. Speaking of fall, given the height at which it was done, it's believed that Alexandre was the one who had cut the safety net outside the window. He was likely doing this while the Madastra was changing Isabella out of her bloody clothing. Isabella was actually found wearing her brother's shirt, but hers was ultimately found, bloodstains and all, even though Alexandre tried to claim that the stain was ice cream, while the Madastra tried to claim that it was soda. Ironically, this was pretty much the only difference in their otherwise very well-rehearsed stories, but I digress. Once Isabella had been thrown, Alexandre then ran down to the lobby to begin his performance, while the Madastra stayed upstairs and cleaned up as much evidence as she could, whilst frantically calling her father and her father-in-law, and then Anna Carolina. And, well, y'all know the story from there. What might surprise you, though, is that despite their abhorrent crime, Dr. Rosangela actually emphasized that neither of the Nardonis were, like, standalone psychopaths. Rather, she hypothesized that they were obtuse, impulsive people with no grasp of the real-world implications or consequences that their actions might have. Furthermore, she also asserted that the two were likely experiencing folie à deux, which is a French term for shared madness. Basically implying that if either of them had been alone with Isabella that faithful night, this likely wouldn't have happened, and that little girl would still be alive today. And you know, sitting here and relaying all this information to you guys now sounds pretty bulletproof, doesn't it? Well, unfortunately, once you start peeling things back, it's not quite as perfect as you might think. The prosecution was actually called out for multiple elements that they had seemed to leave out simply because they didn't fit their narrative. And that's outside of the defense team's argument that the crime scene within the Nardonis' apartment had been seriously contaminated. Throughout the hours following Isabella's death, the apartment was entered by no less than 14 police officers, 3 neighbors, and 1 lady that just came to offer cake and coffee to the police. And while admittedly hearing that contaminated sounds like a bit of an understatement, bear in mind a famous quote from world-renowned forensic scientist Dr. Henry Chang-Yu Lee that states, quote, "Every crime scene is contaminated the moment we arrive." It does kind of put things into perspective. Now, that's not to excuse Donna Maria and her fucking cake and coffee, but Dr. Lee is right. Is there really any such thing as a completely uncontaminated crime scene? Granted, maybe this one does sound more traipsed through than most, but you get what I'm saying. At least I hope you do. Overall, the trial lasted 5 days before the jury was excused to deliberate, and while they did so, through long and grueling hours, public interest in Isabella, it never faltered. People waited outside the courthouse with bated breath the entire time. People refused to go home, even for short periods of time, just out of fear that they might miss a second of the announcement of the verdict. Not that it would have been easy to not hear it, considering the fact that the judge in the case ordered for loudspeakers to be set up outside of the courthouse to broadcast the verdict when it did come. He claims he wanted this done to prevent the media from mincing his words or from twisting the narrative in any one particular way, but his true motive behind this decision has definitely been heavily scrutinized over the years. Personally, I think it was to send a message to the public that like they could trust the system. Because look, we're being so transparent here. We got you. That's just my own speculation though, and I ain't nobody, so your guess is as good as mine. Regardless, finally, after like the longest 2 years ever in Brazil, the verdict came down in the early morning hours of March 27th, 2010. Alexandre Alves Nardoni and Ana Carolina Trata Peixoto Jatoba were guilty. Y'all, it was like Brazil had just won the World Cup. After hearing that these two vile people had been declared guilty of intentional homicide against a minor, people went hard. They were cheering, they were setting off fireworks, they were celebrating. It basically looked like New Year's Eve in Times Square. For their crimes, Alexandre was sentenced to 31 years, 1 month, and 10 days, and Anna Karolina Jatoba was sentenced to 26 years and 8 months. Following their conviction and their sentencing, they were both imprisoned at the Tremembe Penitentiary 2, which is actually more commonly known as the Prison of the Famous. Over the years, they have both continued to maintain their innocence. Actually, following the verdict, their defense team talked about the potential of seeking an appeal, but the prosecution has always been confident that neither would ever see a new trial. Some people have started to wonder over the years if, considering that neither of the Nardonis have ever turned on each other and are, to my knowledge, still together, some people think that maybe they really were telling the truth. Maybe they were victims of like a huge judicial mistake. And I can see where this thought would come from, because a lot, if not most of the time, once couples like this are separated, they do eventually go to roll on each other in an attempt to save themselves. But personally, where this case is considered, I think it's more of a what's done is done type deal. That after everything went down, they decided to just bide their time for as long as possible so that when they are released, they can return to sort of a normal life. Why confess and risk losing the 2, maybe 3 sympathizers they have? I mean, even Dahmer and Bundy had sympathizers, so yeah, these asshats probably do too, and confessing only stands to wreck that. Well, stood to wreck that, because hold on to your butts, Anna Karolina Jatoba, she was released mid-last year. In 2022, both she and Alexandre were granted special furloughs for things like Mother's Day and Father's Day, which... Are we fucking serious? These are some of the last people on Earth that deserve to be celebrated for their parenting. But yeah, then last year, after serving 15-ish years, if you count the time she served leading up to the trial, the infamous Madastra was released. And just in case you're not sufficiently pissed off by that, let me drop this little nugget for you. Since her release, she's actually been seen on multiple occasions visiting Isabella's grave. Now, innocent or not, I think that this is performative. She never liked Isabella. So no matter how you look at it, to me, visiting the grave just seems like a desperate attempt to save face. And that is absolutely vile. You have done enough. Let that poor girl rest in peace. Thankfully, Alexandre remains incarcerated to this day, although my guess is he'll probably get out sooner rather than later as well, but for right now, he is still locked up. And as for Anna Karolina, she has since remarried. She and her new husband have 2 children of their own, 1 boy and 1 girl, and while she continues to mourn Isabella every single day, she does find comfort in knowing that their little family of 4 has just the sweetest and most precious little guardian angel looking down on them. And with that, you guys, we are about wrapped for today. Rest in peace to sweet Isabella at just 5 years old. She quite literally had her entire life ahead of her, and it was so selfishly and despicably taken from her by some of the people in her life that were supposed to protect her at all costs. Oh shit, that reminds me. Filicide. Remember filicide? Good times. Oh god, this video's been long. I think that the 2 types of filicide that were at play here were unwanted child with a little dash of spousal revenge. Alexandre didn't want to deal with Isabella anymore. The Madastra never wanted to deal with Isabella, and I think it was a bonus to both of them that killing Isabella would hurt Anna Karolina. That said though, I'm no expert, so feel free to chime in with your opinions on that, as well as just the case in general, in the comments down below. As always, I thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video and to listen to this story. Ooh, and one last muito grande thank you to our Isabella for requesting this case and for corresponding with me for weeks to help make sure I didn't come on here and make a complete ass out of myself. I cannot even begin to put into words how much I appreciate everything she did in order to assist me getting this video together for you guys. So if you could please take a minute and show her some love down below, I would really appreciate it. She deserves it. If you have a case or a topic you'd like to see me cover, please fill out the request submission form that I have linked in the description. And if you're into the makeup aspect of these videos, hopefully I have all the links and information for the products I used today listed down there as well. I know I'm really bad at that, but I promise I'm trying to get better. If you haven't already and you'd like to, go ahead and subscribe to my channel. I put out new videos every 10 days. Did you catch that? Yes, I am switching from every Monday to every 10 days. The other day, I sat down and I really thought about how long it takes me to complete each aspect of these videos, and I've come to the conclusion that posting every 10 days should help me be more consistent. Listen, I know I keep saying that, and I also know that other people are able to just like pump out content like it's their job, but that's just not the season of life I'm in right now, regardless of how much I wish it was. Trust me, I am probably more frustrated with myself than anyone at this point. I appreciate your guys' patience and grace with me so much as I'm constantly floundering around. I promise I am trying to do better. And eventually, I'll get there. So yeah, subscribe, because how could you not after such incredible self-promotion? Subscribe and turn on your post notifications. That way you'll always be notified when I do post, and you'll always be sure to catch me back here in my next one, which will be in 10 days. Until then, stay safe and have a good week. Bye. I'm trying my fucking hardest, bitch. I'm so damn white. Tragic. Oh, we are off to a miserable start today. Well, that's not gonna work. On other occasions, am I all right? Surprise, surprise. Surprise, surprise. The apnet. Am I all right? Delicious. Blood in the Darnoti. Jesus fucking Christ, man. Chandra. Yeah, I bit my tongue. I'm sweating like a fucking hog. Oh my god, I've never been this sweaty in my life. My titties are sweating. Is that a drip of sweat down my back? Is that another spider? Shut the fuck up. Why is this one over my goddamn head, too? Dude, I am not gonna make it. I'm gonna...